Sophia stood at the counter, mechanically processing the order, her gaze clouded. Outside, the autumn rain was starting to accumulate again, and inside the cafe, it was stuffy, as it always was on days like this. She glanced at the clock. There were still a few hours left before her shift ended. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the intrusive thought that had been bothering her since the morning. Sophia felt as if her life had come to a standstill. Working as a waitress in a small cafe in the city centre brought neither joy nor satisfaction. She had been here for 2 years, and while she liked the atmosphere, the cafe was cozy and local with a homely vibe, it was becoming increasingly monotonous and draining. With each passing day, the number of dissatisfied customers demanding more and more attention grew, while the number of thanks and tips remained unchanged. Minimal. Sophia had come here with the hope of starting a new life. She was young, ambitious, and wanted to do something meaningful, but with each month her dreams became more and more foggy. The cafe, though it attracted the attention of both tourists and locals, was nothing special. It didn't have exquisite dishes or a unique style. It was just a spot in the city centre where people came to grab a quick bite or spend some time, not expecting anything more. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that her work was undervalued. Every day felt like the one before. The same service standards, the same work schedule, the same demands. She smiled at the customers, trying her best, but sometimes it felt unbearable. No matter how much kindness she tried to radiate, complaints about long waits, poorly prepared food, or even the temperature in the room could often be heard behind her back. All these negative moments created a wall of alienation in her soul, but she tried not to show it. Today only worsened her gloomy mood. From the very beginning of the day, Sophia had encountered rude customers who didn't even bother to leave a couple of coins. One man handed her the check without a hint of gratitude, not even glancing at her, and another couple with children left without a word of thanks after she wiped down their table from spilled juice. At the end of not a single bill, all she had earned that entire day was a glass of cold water and several hours of endless battling with unhappy customers. At that moment, her vision started to blur from exhaustion. She couldn't stop thinking that life was passing her by. For some reason it seemed to her that if she were in a different place with a different circle of people, everything would be different. Why was everything so hard? Why couldn't she see a way out of this routine? Sophia had been thinking about changing jobs for several months, but she was too afraid of the unknown. This small cafe seemed to be the only place where she could still feel somewhat safe, where she could still earn a living. She returned to her workstation and took another order. Everything around her felt familiar. The constant noise, the clinking of dishes, the loud conversations of customers, children running through the hall. Sophia tried not to pay attention to the hustle and bustle, but her thoughts kept returning to the fact that she longed to change her day, to break free, to feel joy from her work. Sophia glanced at the table where an elderly man had just sat down in the corner of the cafe. Outwardly, he was as unremarkable as many other visitors who came here for a cup of coffee or a bowl of soup. His clothes were simple: a plaid shirt, a slightly wrinkled jacket, and old glasses through which he carefully studied the menu. His age was apparent, but not because of his grey hair, but rather because of the calmness he radiated. Sophia approached the table with exhaustion on her face, ready to face yet another one of those customers who would inevitably complain about every little detail. Coffee too hot, the wrong portion, not enough sugar. She had already encountered a few dissatisfied customers during this shift, and her patience was wearing thin. Besides, this man didn't look like the type who would leave a decent tip. When she reached the table, he slowly raised his eyes from the menu, meeting her gaze with calm, unhurried eyes. He wasn't in a rush, not waiting for her words, just waiting, as if he had all the time in the world. Sophia opened her mouth to offer him the menu, but the man broke the silence first. "Just a cup of black coffee, please." His voice was calm and quiet, without a trace of arrogance, as if it were the most ordinary request, something he could share with any waiter. Sophia nodded, not trying to hide her fatigue. It was so standard that she didn't even want to waste time on extra questions. She was used to such orders. "Just a cup of coffee, 1 sugar, and a couple of minutes to prepare." She didn't expect anything interesting from this elderly man, and her internal reaction was more wary than curious. There was nothing in his behavior that set him apart from the mass of other customers. She was already mentally preparing herself for another unremarkable, uneventful conversation with one of the many pensioners who often came here to enjoy the silence and the aroma of coffee. "Black coffee, right?" she asked, just to confirm the order. He nodded and returned to his menu, showing no particular interest in the conversation. Sophia decided not to drag out the interaction and went to the bar to fulfill his request. On her way, she found herself quietly laughing to herself, anticipating that this day, like all the others, would end with yet another dull and forgettable conversation with one of the many elderly customers who frequented the café. But despite her skepticism, there was no anger in Sophia's heart, just disappointment. She increasingly felt that her own life had become something mundane and expressionless, and the people she served brought her no joy. Every day she repeated the same actions, and every evening she felt like she had become a part of these ordinary, grey days that led nowhere. Meanwhile, the elderly man remained seated in the corner of the café, leisurely looking at his hands or perhaps recalling something from the past. He wasn't in a hurry. Sophia returned to her station, holding a cup of black coffee for the elderly man whose encounter with her had begun so ordinarily. However, as soon as she took a step toward the counter, her gaze fell again on the noisy group in the corner of the café. A group of young people had claimed an entire corner, making it clear to everyone around that they were in charge here. "What's your name?" Laughter, loud conversations, clumsy attempts to draw attention, everything blended into a sound wave that grew louder with each passing moment. One of the young men, probably noticing that the waitress was taking too long to approach their table, stood up and shouted, "Hey, we need another drink, we've been waiting." Sophia felt the tension inside her rise. Her day, like her recent life, was already filled with small annoyances and frustrations. She felt her patience wearing thin with each new moment. No matter how hard she tried to smile and hide her exhaustion, the noise didn't stop. Sophia gritted her teeth and walked toward the group. She felt her face tense up and her movements became sharper. When she reached the table, her voice was cold and direct. "You need anything else, or will you continue shouting loudly enough for everyone around to hear?" The young people immediately fell silent. One of them, a guy with bright tattoos on his arms, looked at her in surprise, even with a hint of a smirk. "We just asked," he said, but his tone seemed more concerned with not showing that it bothered him than with offering any apologies. Sophia glared at them, not hiding her irritation, and cast a quick glance at the glasses on their table. "I heard you," she said, her voice now much colder. "Next time, try not to shout if you want me to continue doing my job properly." With those words, she turned and walked back to the bar, giving them no chance to respond. Her breathing was heavy. She felt her nervousness take over, and now a storm of frustration raged inside her. Thoughts spun in her head about how her life had reached a dead end, and how every action she took reflected exhaustion and hopelessness. These people in the cafe likely had no idea how hard it was to be in her shoes. Sophia couldn't even remember the last time anyone had shown her the slightest bit of attention. Placing the drink on the counter, she noticed his gaze. The elderly man in the plaid shirt and old glasses was still sitting in his spot. His eyes were following her, but they didn't carry the judgment she was used to from others. There was no disappointment, no anger, just calmness, and perhaps a slight concern. He didn't try to intervene, didn't try to judge her, but his gaze made her feel something strange. But you weren't trying to interfere, whether she did interfere or not. Sophia felt her unease growing. She couldn't understand why his presence had suddenly become so important. Why did this old, silent observer affect her so much? Sophia looked at him again and unexpectedly felt a pang of shame. She hadn't expected that one glance could have such an impact on her emotions. It was a gaze that didn't condemn, didn't yell at her, but simply observed. It was like a reminder, perhaps of something important she had long overlooked. Something she had lost long ago. Sophia returned to the table with a cup of coffee for another customer, but her gaze once again fell on the elderly man sitting by the window. He had already finished his coffee and carefully placed the cup on the saucer. His hand, with barely noticeable wrinkles, reached for his wallet, and as Sophia passed by, she noticed that there was a significantly larger sum of money on the table than she usually received from customers. This wasn't just a generous tip. It seemed like money left with the intent to show appreciation. Sophia couldn't help but notice that for a single cup of black coffee, this was clearly more than she had expected. She caught herself thinking that her perception of the man had likely been too superficial. He was dressed modestly, didn't stand out among the usual patrons, and she had quickly decided that he was just another elderly customer. But the money, that money was so unusual that Sophia felt a sense of doubt about her own perception. Something in his gesture made her stop and reflect. Sophia couldn't just walk away. This was a moment when she decided to thank him for his generosity and perhaps lighten the atmosphere a little. She approached the table with a smile and a composed expression on her face. "Thank you very much for the tip," she said, expecting to see a friendly smile or some kind of gratitude in return. But instead the man, almost as if sensing her expectation, calmly and unhurriedly looked at her. "I'm glad I can help," he said, then added with a slight smile, "By the way, I'm Tom Hanks." Sophia froze. The words sounded as though he had just introduced himself like any other person in the cafe, but in her head, like a lightning bolt, the thought flashed that she had just learned one of the most famous names in Hollywood. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. She couldn't believe her ears. Tom Hanks, one of the most beloved actors of modern times. This man, sitting quietly at a table, not drawing attention to himself, not trying to stand out. Was it really him? Sophia felt her face blush slightly, and a storm of emotions rushed through her. Embarrassment, awkwardness, and even shame. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have been so rude, ignoring this moment, treating him like just another elderly client? Like anyone else? Sophia couldn't collect her thoughts right away. She stood before him, unsure of what to say, and his calm face only intensified her confusion. Tom Hanks, despite his fame, appeared so natural, so unpretentious, that it made her feel even more awkward. She thought that, in this moment, he had become a mirror for her own rudeness, her tired, weary life, where she had stopped appreciating the people around her, putting her exhaustion and disappointments above everything else. "I'm sorry, she began, but the words wouldn't come. The realization of how she had treated him caught her off guard. It was a moment that made her rethink so much, to look at herself from the outside. She felt not only bored but also sad, realizing how often she had been rude to people, not noticing them, not appreciating their humanity or their kind deeds. Tom Hanks, noticing her confusion, smiled slightly. He didn't emphasize her embarrassment and calmly continued. "It's all right. We all have our moments. It's normal." His words were an unexpected relief for Sophia, but at the same time, they made her think even more about how she evaluated people, how often she judged based on appearances, on first impressions. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt for her behavior, and although his words were kind, they couldn't erase what she had felt in that moment. She thanked him, barely holding back her emotions, and hurried back to her duties. But thoughts of Tom Hanks and his unexpected humility stayed with her. After Sophia finished serving the table by the window and approached the bar counter, she noticed that Tom Hanks, who had been sitting quietly at his table before, had left his seat. His movement was unhurried yet confident, and as if anticipating that Sophia was thinking about something, he caught her attention. He stood nearby with a slight smile, but in his gaze there was something more than just attention. There was an inner light, radiated by a person who understands and feels others. Sophia froze, slightly puzzled, unsure of what to expect from him. He walked over to her with that same gentle and calm confidence that had always characterized his characters on screen. He didn't seem like someone who wanted to lecture her or offer advice. His words were more of a simple, sincere reminder. "You know, I understand that you're tired," Tom began, speaking calmly, but in a way that his words immediately began to reach her soul. "And you're allowed to be irritated. That's okay. We all lose our patience sometimes, but don't forget that there's always someone who sees your work and your mood. You're not alone. You're part of this world, and every person, every customer you meet can make your day better if you show just a little bit of patience." Sophia stood frozen, stunned by his words. This wasn't the usual empty compliment, not a rehearsed phrase of politeness. Tom spoke sincerely, with deep understanding. It was as if he had gone through something similar himself and come to the realization of how important it is to maintain kindness and tolerance in any situation. Do you really think that?" she asked quietly, feeling something inside her beginning to shift. Her voice sounded tired, but there was also hope in it, as though she was seeking an answer to a long-standing question. How can she find the strength to continue without losing herself? "Yes," Tom replied, smiling, but his gaze was serious. "It's not always easy, but you'll see how everything around you changes if you try to approach people with an open heart, rather than seeing them as obstacles in your life. Trust me, you can surprise yourself." Sophia stood there, somewhat bewildered, not knowing what to say. He hadn't just given her advice, it seemed as though he believed in her. How strange and wonderful it was to hear such words from someone she had considered an unattainable star. In that small, quiet moment, she felt that her problems, her exhaustion, all of it, could be overcome. But to do so, she would have to learn to let go of negativity and look at people and life from a different perspective. Noticing her silence, Tom gently added, "Every day is a chance to start anew, and every person can be a teacher if you're ready to listen. And this isn't just for you, but for them too. Everyone you meet is going through something of their own. You are too. But maybe, if you shift your perspective just a little, the world will feel easier and brighter." His words made her reflect, and suddenly her eyes filled with gratitude. Sophia felt a growing sense of determination inside her. She realized that she needed to change her attitude not just toward customers, but toward herself as well. It was important to learn to be tolerant, not only with others, but with herself. It was important to allow herself to not be perfect, and not demand the impossible from herself. Tom left, leaving her with this important lesson, and Sophia stood at the counter for a long time, digesting what had been said. Her gaze became clearer again, and inside her there was no longer the same irritation. In that moment she realized, change begins with a simple step. And that step needed to be taken right now. This moment was like an awakening for her. Today felt like a new start, giving her a chance to change something. She remembered Tom Hanks' words. They sounded like a quiet yet convincing impulse. He hadn't judged her. He had given her the opportunity to view her life from a different angle. Now, even though her head was full of thoughts, she suddenly wanted to act differently, without irritation and exhaustion. When a couple was sitting at the window table and the man and woman were discussing the menu, Sophia approached them with a smile. She felt how the smile became not just a mechanical gesture, but a genuine expression of her readiness to help and be attentive. Instead of immediately leaning over and offering standard options with irritation, she listened carefully to them, genuinely asking about their preferences. She noticed how the man appreciated her approach, and the woman gently nodded when Sophia suggested a few alternative dishes. "I'm glad I'm here," Sophia thought, feeling how her mood began to change. The inner irritation she had carried with her for so long seemed to retreat. She noticed how this simple interaction with customers gave her something more than just fulfilling her duties. It was gratitude, genuine attention, and even an exchange of energy. Next, another customer approached her table, asking for extra milk in his coffee. In the past, she would have just glanced at him briefly, reacting to his request with irritation, thinking of it as just another trivial thing to serve. But now, Sophia didn't rush, and instead of silently fulfilling the request, she politely asked him to wait while she brought the milk, even joking a bit, asking if he wanted to try different kinds. This simple phrase, spoken with a smile, showed her how differently she could view people and work. Instead of seeing customers as a burden, she began to see them as interesting individuals with different needs and requests, and it was refreshing. When she returned to the bar counter for a short break, she noticed how easily she was breathing. Her gaze had become more open, and her heart felt calm. The customers weren't rushing her, weren't demanding anything extraordinary. They seemed friendlier, more appreciative. She could feel how her approach to them was changing, and with that, their attitude toward her was changing too. When the next order came, Sophia approached the table with full confidence and calmness. She wasn't just mechanically taking care of the order, she was trying not to forget the smile, even when something went wrong. At the table, a group of young people whom she had previously seen as a source of irritation turned out to be friendly. When one of the young men asked her about dessert, she didn't respond coldly. Instead, she enthusiastically described each option, offering them something based on their preferences. Rather than feeling tense, she began to see it as an opportunity, a chance to communicate, to be helpful, to make people happy. Passing by Tom Hanks, who was sitting at the same table, she noticed him raise his gaze and smile at her. It was the same gaze she remembered, not judgmental but supportive. It seemed as though he hadn't just noticed her change, but was genuinely happy for her. Sophia couldn't help but notice how everything around her had become brighter, how even her colleagues had started looking at her with respect, and how the customers had become noticeably kinder. Had she overcome herself, even more importantly, she felt that this change had given her new strength and a new perspective on the world. It wasn't an easy step, but every new day at the cafe felt like a step forward, and she knew that if she could continue this way, life could be much brighter and more fulfilling than she had ever imagined. Several days had passed since Sophia had heard Tom Hanks' words. Every day as she arrived at work, she began to see her customers in a new light. In the morning, she no longer felt the weight that used to rest on her shoulders. Work no longer felt like a burden. Instead of irritation rising from the little things, she had learned to greet people with a smile and attention. Every customer now felt like more than just an order. They were individuals she could connect with, help, even if it was just by serving them a cup of coffee. Today, the morning was like any other. Her shift began in the same cafe, in the same place, surrounded by the same noisy conversations and clinking dishes, but something inside her had changed. When she approached one of the tables, where an elderly man had been coming for several days, she offered him a cup of tea with such sincere kindness that he couldn't help but notice her transformation. "Are you enjoying yourself today? Is everything okay?" she asked with a smile, trying to listen not just to his words, but to his tone as well. The man looked at her a little surprised, but soon his face lit up with a warm smile. "It's so nice to see such a friendly atmosphere," he said. "It's rare to encounter such an approach these days." It was a small moment, but for Sophia it meant so much more. She felt once again that her work wasn't in vain. And it wasn't just about the tips, which were sometimes too modest, or the need to please every customer. It was something deeper, a sense of fulfillment from knowing she had given something to people. As her shift came to an end, Sophia began cleaning the tables, sweeping the floors, and folding the menus, when she suddenly noticed an envelope on one of the tables. At first she didn't realize what it was, but soon she saw a note inside. Opening it, she found several lines of gratitude. A simple but very sincere text. "Thank you for your kindness and attention. You are an amazing person, and your approach makes this world a little better. It's nice to see people who can do even the most ordinary things with heart." There were also quite generous tips left at the bottom, which surprised her as well. She couldn't figure out who had written it, as there was no name or any indication of the person who had left these words. But what mattered more wasn't who had left it, but what Sophia felt. The words of this person, sincere and full of gratitude, were proof to her that the changes in her behavior had made a real impact. She felt pride and satisfaction because her efforts had been noticed. This wasn't just gratitude for good service, it was a sign that her internal changes had reflected in her work and in her life. As she picked up the envelope, Sophia felt something shifting inside her. She was no longer just doing her job. Her attitude toward customers had become part of her life. She began to feel that every moment at work was an opportunity to express herself, a chance to become better, first and foremost for herself. When she returned home that evening, she hugged her cat, smiling, and silently thanked Tom Hanks for his lesson. His words were simple, but they had become the guiding light that led her to the realization it's not just about doing your job, but doing it with respect for yourself and those around you. She now knew that even in the most difficult situations, there is always a moment for kindness, and that change starts with us.